someone might say, or in discussions with people, or the feast-keeping theology basically says, well, all you said is good, but Paul says here, let us keep the feast. So we will keep the feast. We will do what Paul says. When Adam sinned, as we said, God instructed him to sacrifice a lamb, a symbol of the coming Savior. And this type, from the gates of Eden, would last all the way till the Savior did come. And of course, this was passed on from father to son, and the patriarchs there, they knew that from the gates of Eden they received this promise of a Savior in this sacrifice. And so Abraham sacrificed, Isaac sacrificed, and Jacob sacrificed. But they did not know anything about feast days. You see, it was later on that God added to the sacrifices the feasts, which indicated certain times and events of things that will happen in the plan of salvation. Now, the reason why I'm emphasizing that is because a lot of the times people say, well, the feasts, they had sacrifices on them. Well, the Sabbath had sacrifices too, and so we still keep the Sabbath without the sacrifices, so we can therefore keep the feast without the sacrifices, and try and disengage or separate the feasts from the sacrifices. I'll tell you now, you cannot do that. You cannot do this. We'll see why in the scriptures why you cannot do that. The Sabbath was never married to the sacrifices, as we shall see. Let me illustrate that. I like illustrations, if you haven't figured that out yet. The Sabbath was given in Eden, right? And then at the fall, sacrifices were instituted. And no doubt, when people would come to worship on the Sabbath, part of their worship would have involved offering sacrifices, an expression of their faith in the coming Savior. But the Sabbath existed before sacrifices and independent of sacrifices. Later on, God instituted the sacrificial system. And then at the Exodus and at Sinai, God added other elements to the sacrificial system that was already in place. He added feasts, He added a sanctuary, and He added a priesthood, among other things. And these three elements, brothers and sisters, were all tied and married to the sacrifices. The priesthood, its purpose and function was to offer sacrifices. You can't have a priest with nothing to offer, right? The sanctuary was the place where you offered these sacrifices. And the feasts were the special times and seasons and occasions to offer these sacrifices. They were married and tied to this system, and they were actually subservient to it, to the sacrificial system. The entire Jewish economy revolved around the sacrificial system, or around the symbol for Christ. That's what it was all about. And so this particular point, as far as the feast being for sacrifice, I want to read this verse from the same chapter, Leviticus 23. These are the feasts of the Lord which ye shall proclaim, to be holy convocations, to offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord, a burnt offering and a meat offering, a sacrifice and a drink offering, everything upon his day. Notice what the purpose of the feast here is according to this verse. It is to do what? To offer an offering. So I'll ask you a question. Of the two, which is more important and significant? The feasts or the sacrifices? The sacrifices. Let me ask it this way. Can you keep the feast without offering a sacrifice when God gave this instruction? No. Could you keep the sacrifices without having a feast? There was a time when these sacrifices existed and you can't sacrifice without having a feast. So of the two, one is more important than the other, and one is attached to the other in this relationship. And there's a reason why I'm saying that, and there's a reason why God set it up this way, as we shall see. And the reason and the purpose for this entire system that God gave, Hebrews 9 and verse 10 tells us about the first covenant and the tabernacle, which stood only in meats and in drinks and in divers washings and carnal ordinances, imposed on them until the time of Reformation. What's the time of Reformation? The coming of Christ. It was a temporary system. God instituted a temporary system on Mount Sinai to last until the seed should come. And this is what the time of Reformation is talking about. Wherefore then serveth the law, it was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come. That's the first coming of Christ. To whom the promise was made, and it was ordained by angels in the hand of a mediator. That's the time of Reformation. And at such a time, this system would come to an end. And the verse that indicates that to us is Daniel chapter 9 and verse 27. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. Now, many times I have heard this verse quoted and used to prove that the sacrifices and the oblations ceased. And that's the only thing that ceased and nothing else. But brothers and sisters, when God talks about the sacrifices and oblations, He is talking about the primary symbol that represents Christ and everything that was attached to it along the way. God does not have to spell out every single thing that was attached to the sacrificial system. When that went, everything attached with it went. I'll put it here in our illustration. When He causes the sacrifice and oblation to cease, if the sacrifice goes, do you still keep the seventh-day Sabbath? Because it pre-existed the sacrificial system, right? It stands on its own. It was never attached to the sacrificial system. It was never dependent on the sacrificial system. But when the sacrifices go, does the priesthood go? Well, what's the priest going to offer? He has nothing else to offer. So this Aaronic priesthood, the priesthood that God instituted at Mount Sinai, goes with the sacrifice. So in Daniel, God does not have to say also the priesthood is also ceased. That's included in the sacrifices ceasing, so that goes. What about the sanctuary? Same reasoning. Of course it goes. God doesn't say, oh, by the way, and the sanctuary also will cease. When the sacrifices ceased, everything subservient to it and attached to it automatically goes. So what about the feasts? Or will they stay? That's the argument. That is not consistent. That does not make sense, brothers and sisters. The feasts were dependent on the sacrifices. The feasts are actually included in that verse. When God brought to an end the system of sacrifices and oblations, with it goes the days that were given to offer certain sacrifices on. And so this is why the time of the Reformation is the time when these things came to an end. These were all ceremonial types that pointed forward to the coming of the Savior. 1 Corinthians 5, 7 and 8. We referred to that already. But it says, purge out therefore the old leaven, that ye may be a new lump, as ye are unleavened. For even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, neither with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. And usually, you know, someone might say, or in discussions with people, or the feast-keeping theology basically says, well, you know, all you said is good, but Paul says here, let us keep the feast. So we will keep the feast. We will do what Paul says. So this is why we keep the feast. And what does Paul mean? The problem in Corinth, brothers and sisters, was not whether they were keeping the feast or not. This was not their issue. The issue in Corinth was sin in the camp. Remember some guy with his mother or his stepmother or something, there was a sin issue. And Paul was telling them to deal with this sin issue. He's telling them, listen, purge out the leaven. Get rid of sin from among you. He is using the language of the feast to illustrate a spiritual truth. The language of the feast that he uses is symbolic. He's not talking about literal leaven. He's not talking about real leaven that you put in the bread. He's not telling them get rid of that. He's telling them get rid of sin out of the camp. And he says the reason for that is Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. Always, not just for a particular time period. Christ is not just our Passover for a week. He is always our Passover. He sacrificed for us. It's because Christ now has come and fulfilled that. Let us live the reality and the fulfillment of what He accomplished by, therefore, let us keep the feast. So what he's talking about here is not a literal keeping of 1 week. If you look it up in the Greek, it actually means let us keep on keeping a feast. Let us keep a continual feast. In other words, he's saying, let us live our life. Because Christ is our Passover, let us live our life as a perpetual feast, free from leaven, the leaven of malice and wickedness and sin. He's using the language of the feast to illustrate a spiritual truth. It wasn't only to last for a week. It was to be their experience from then on. Because Paul is not trying to institute feasts that he calls elsewhere shadows. You with me? It is contradicting himself otherwise. And so this is what the contextual understanding and explanation of this verse is. That's how we are to keep the feasts. The feast today. We are all to keep this feast with the unleavened bread of truth, in sincerity and truth, not with wickedness or malice.